All right, it's Colleen here again, picking up on part 2 of our lecture video. I'm going to introduce a few more key terms and concepts that relate to narrative in art, particularly non-objective narratives. And we're going to talk a little bit more about visual hierarchy, and then we're going to get into an overview of what project number 2 is going to be. All right, so non-objective narratives in art. A narrative tells a story, and it does so through a sequence of events, right? A storyboard is a great example of how we could draw out the narrative of a story. But how do we do that with non-objective shapes? How do we tell a story when we don't have representation to give us cues to what the story is about? Well, for our next project, we are going to do just that. We are going to use non-objective shapes, organic shape, geometric shape, dynamic shape, static shape, any kind of shape we want. And we're going to apply it to meaning. We're going to create meaning through the elements of art, color, line, shape. Sorry, shape is an element of art, but you get what I'm saying. Color, I think I already said that. And placement of those elements of art, which we would refer to as the principles of design. So the principles of design are things like variety, balance. It's where we place the elements of art. And through that placement, we're going to tell our narrative. And we can do that through visual hierarchy. Visual hierarchy is going to give us the sort of cues for the viewer to follow the narrative, right? Because if we go back, visual hierarchy is when we call attention, guide the viewer, and then hold their attention. And wherever we call the attention could be the beginning of a story. We guide them through the story and we hold their attention throughout. And we will even give them an exit to the story in the case of what we're doing for our project, which I'll get into more in just a second. We can see here, this is some past student work from this project where we have sort of an indication, and maybe a little bit too literal in my opinion, of water. But we have this sort of imagery where as you open up this narrative, you see this sort of red ball, and the red ball is starting off in the air and then it's sort of bouncing into what we'll call the water, even though we need to make this non-objective, jumping into it, becoming encased in it. And in each page, it's sort of drowning. And it's this very simple narrative. The ball starts out in the sky, it becomes enveloped, and then it goes away. So very simple, right? A lot of creating narrative around non-objective shapes is very simple. You have to simplify a story if you're going to tell it using this approach. But how do we hold attention? How do we keep the viewer engaged? How do we have them enter the work and spend time looking? Well, in this case, the student used the placement of the shape to do so and manipulated the shapes to do so. A few other examples of non-objective narratives. Here's an example of Louise Bourgeois, who is a contemporary artist who uses a lot of non-objective narratives, and she tells stories through these fabric books that she creates. And each panel of the sort of quilted piecework fabric has a bit of a story to it. Now, her story is much more non-objective. It's much more open to interpretation. It's a lot more about mood. She's dealt with a mental illness a lot in her life, and a lot of what she does is portraying a mood and a feeling as you open the book and look throughout it. But even the form of a book implies narrative and story. So even if you have no idea what's happening here, as you turn the pages of this fabric book, you know that you're supposed to be following it like some sort of narrative, just because if it's in the format of a book. So just another example of another book, a soft book that Louise Bourgeois has made. Starts off with some text, and then as you turn the pages of the fabric book, you see each one of these panels, which begin to sort of tell this visual narrative through non-objective shape, texture, color, line. So we've got elements of art here, we've got principles of design here that are taking us through the narrative. So for our project, we're going to be creating a non-objective narrative zine. So you may have heard of a zine before. A zine is basically just a term for a self-published work. It is original. It is something that you created yourself. You published it yourself. It often contains text or images that are typically created for small scale circulation. So we've heard of a magazine, which is not self-published. It's published through a magazine company. So zines are kind of stealing that back end of the word, zine, and self-publishing it. And the intention is not to give it to a million people like a magazine might be or a newspaper, but rather to have small scale circulation. And typically a zine is non-commercial. That means that you're not creating the zine to sell it, or if you are selling it, you're only selling it enough to keep making more zines. You're not trying to make a huge profit off of your work. Typically, the subject matter of a zine is very specialized or unconventional. So what created zines was a need for content, information, imagery that was not in the mainstream. So let's look at feminism, for example. The history of feminism is that there's been sort of 2, now 3 waves of feminism. And in the 60s, it was very clear in a lot of publications like magazines and newspapers and even on TV and billboards, advertising, that women were being portrayed as sort of over-sexualized. They were being portrayed often in a domestic setting, which was not necessarily realistic to where a lot of women were. A lot of women were starting to work during this time. It was not that their place was only in the home. Their place was also out in public. There was a shift where second wave feminism comes about and women start to discuss amongst themselves that this is an inequality, this is an issue. We're not seeing ourselves represented in the way that we want in these different commercial publications. There's a reason for that. Magazines, billboards, advertising, books, whatever, these bigger published items make money, right? They sell a message. They sell a message of misogyny. They sell a message of the fact that women are not equal to men. And that was the way things were looked at during that time period. So a lot of women and men got together, called themselves feminists, and made zines, these sort of smaller scale publications that sent out alternative messaging about the way that women are represented in society. So we see this become a huge trend in the 60s. And then it starts to go beyond the scope of feminism, and we see it in all different avenues. But typically it's when the mainstream is not publishing content that relates to, whatever someone is trying to express. So here are a few other examples of different zines. We've got some more feminist zines on the bottom left-hand portion. A lot of zines are tutorials or instructionals. So we can see here we have one that has different ice cream flavors, how not to die, how to make a sandwich, how to create origami. So a lot of sort of step-by-step things. So a lot of the sort of ethos of a zine is this sort of do-it-yourself culture, DIY. How can you put things into your own hands and do it? Remember, YouTube did not exist in the 60s and 70s. The internet hardly existed into the 80s and 90s. So people were circulating these zines as a way to express information that they knew was not getting across in any other way, shape, or form. And we still see zines today. It's not that they were just prevalent in the 60s and 70s, but that's just sort of when they started. They became very popular during punk rock in the 80s, and they continue to be pretty popular today. Typically, if we were to see a zine today, a lot of times it's sort of counteractive to social media or counteractive to the fact that we spend so much time on a screen. And it's sort of an alternative platform where we can learn this alternative information without having to look at a screen. So there's lots of ways that you can make a zine, and I'm going to post in our discussion board number 2, which is going to be our rough draft. I'm going to post some helpful tutorials, and I'll do a little demo video that's going to talk more about this. You will be able to choose whatever format you want for your zine. And I'm going to get into the zine more in a second, don't worry. But I just wanted to show you that there's different ways that you can construct one. And one of the most traditional ways is with a piece of old-fashioned copy or computer paper. And it gives you some folding techniques and how to cut it. And it's super easy to make a book without even using any sort of tape or staple or stitching. You are literally just folding and cutting in one place. So it's really simple. And this is certainly an option for the zine that we are making in this class. And you can start with even bigger piece of paper than a copy piece. The reason why traditionally we see it be like a copy piece of paper or a printer paper, sort of that 8.5 by 11, is because to widely distribute a zine, you would design it, you would draw it out, and you would copy it on a copier. And then you could send out, 100 of them if you wanted. But for our class, we can start with bigger paper and make an even larger zine to give us more room to draw. There's lots of different options here. And I'll show you some examples in just a moment. Couple other zine construction things that I'm going to show you that you'll be able to play around with for this class, for this project. We've got a pocket fold zine, we've got accordion zines, saddle stitch. So there are the possibility of going in with a needle and thread and stitching it together like a more traditional book. You can staple your zine. Different folding techniques are all covered here. And again, those will be reposted under discussion board 2. And then some tutorials will be available to you as well. Okay, so we are going to be doing an initial sketchbook assignment, which I'm going to get more into when I do my demo video, but I just wanted you to see here. We're going to be playing around with some storyboards that are going to help us come up with a story. So we're using our zine is going to be the vessel in which we tell a story. And we're going to tell that story through drawing. And we're going to do that using non-objective shapes. The shapes are going to tell the story. Just like that little ball that was in the water we just looked at. And we are going to pick a story that we want. And I'm going to get into that in just a moment as well. But first, I'm going to jump back over to my screen so that we can see Blackboard in our project sheet. So let's go over that together. So again, I call this the non-objective narrative zine project. Our goal is to investigate the use of non-objective shapes as visual indicators of conceptual meaning, and in this case, a sequential narrative or a story. We are going to base it off an existing story. And this story can come from a movie, a book, an old folk tale, something that was maybe a story that was passed on in your family. It can be a personal story of something that literally happened to you before. It can be any story. And we're going to tell that story using shapes that are using two-dimensional elements of art, which is like shape, line, texture, color, and visual hierarchy and the principles of design. So for example, the principles of design are where we decide where to place our elements of art. So for example, we might place a whole lot of textured circles in a pattern on a piece of paper, and that has a lot of variety and rhythm. The words variety and rhythm are principles of design. It's where we decide to put elements of art and place them around. Visual hierarchy, we've already covered in this lecture, so I'm not going to repeat myself, but we are going to be using that as a cue for the viewer to know how to go through your narrative and through your zine. But again, naturally, a zine is going to suggest a story, which is why we're using this format for this project. So that's going to be really helpful. So depending on what sort of zine you want to do in terms of format, whether it's folded or stapled or sewn, you get to kind of have some freedom to decide how small or big you want it to be, what shape you want it to be in. And again, I'll show you some examples in just a minute. But you need to have a minimum of 5 pages of your zine. And there's no maximum. You can have as many pages as you want. But I found doing this project with students over the years that 5 pages is the best. We can't go less than 5 or we're not going to be able to tell our story. Your zine can use any grayscale range medium. So medium is just a fancy word for what material we're using. So for your zine, you can use black marker, black ink, black and gray pens, graphite, charcoal, or black gray acrylic paint. Your composition, if we're looking at just one page of your zine, okay, 95% of that page, of what's drawn on that page, has to be done in the grayscale medium. So anything that ranges from white to black. But we are going to get to incorporate a little bit of color for this project. So if we're looking at that one page, 5% of that page can use color. And I'll show you an example of that. And the reason why we're using just a tiny bit of color is we're going to use it as a tool for our visual hierarchy, because color is a strong way to draw the viewer in. So your goal is to effectively use non-objective shapes as visual indicators of your story. You're going to use organic or geometric. You get to choose on how to emphasize that narrative. You are going to incorporate positive and negative shapes, and you're going to use figure ground reversal. So that's a little twist. You have to use some figure ground reversal in there. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, go back to lecture number 1. You have to use visual hierarchy. We already talked about that. you have to use visual hierarchy in a way to sort of implement the principles of design strategies of emphasis, contrast, unity, size and scale, isolation and or texture. And then you're graded on overall effectiveness and in-class participation. So this is a little bit more freedom than the last project. So, because you're going to get to pick what material and dimensions you do, right? So you can use, again, as long as you're within the realm of 95% black to white and 5% color, can be any medium you want, colored pencils, whatever. Paper medium depends on the format of your zine. So if you're going with something simple like a folded zine, you might use a piece of drawing paper. If you want something a little bit thicker that you're going to sew or staple or just want to be able to handle something that's a little more stronger, then you might use your bristle board paper or some sort of cardstock. There's lots of different mixed media papers out there as well. You could use something like watercolor paper if you're going to have a wet medium like paint. But please no poster board. I got a thing about poster board in this class, which you'll find me say a couple times throughout the duration of the class. Poster boards imply a science project from, like elementary school. We're not going to use that as a material in the class. You're going to find yourself probably needing a ruler, an X-Acto knife, a sharpener, an eraser for this assignment, and then optional things. You might need a needle and thread, staple, scissors, stamps, something that you might end up using that is particular to the format of your zine. All right, so I want to show you some past student examples to kind of give a better picture of what we're doing here. I'm trying to make this a little bit bigger. Okay, so if we look at the left-hand side, actually, I'm going to try to make this in one page so you can see it. That didn't make it any bigger. Never mind. Okay, we'll look at it together. So our first example, your zine is going to have at least 5 pages, okay? And your zine is naturally going to have a cover. So you're going to need to think about what's on the cover. It could be the beginning of your story. It could be just like we would see a normal book cover, some sort of design that relates to the story. But everything in the imagery has to be non-objective, non-representational, something we do not recognize. But it doesn't mean you can't be inspired by a shape that is representational, like we did in our first project. And in this first example, I'm going to show you, this is a story that talks about Chinese foot binding, which is a historic practice of binding a woman's foot in effort to make it not grow, because small feet are seen as a sort of attractive quality of a woman within sort of more ancient historic Chinese culture. And this particular student was inspired by a short story that she had read. And if we look at the cover, I did give her permission to use some representation in the text where she told a little portion of the story. She had printed it onto the cover. But we can see then when we move over to page 1, we can see this shape, this red shape that she's created, which is sort of the shape of a foot, but not really. So she's taking a little bit from representation, but she's abstracting it enough to where it's not objective. Okay, so we have this sort of foot form. We have this circular area that's on it, and they're combined together. Could imply this idea of, a baby was born and it is one with its family. And then in page 2 and 3, so 2 here, 3 here, we see that this sort of outside force is sort of happening where it's coming to take over the foot form. And the red is real powerful around it, kind of almost giving this sort of assumption of something dangerous. And then it takes it from here where it's harming it, it's hurting it, and now it has shaped it. And then we see at the end, the foot form is then sort of changed, altered from this last one. And the idea is to talk about just the story of this child whose foot was binded from her family at a young age. So it's meant to talk about the sort of smothering, the enveloping, the sadness related to it, the sadness of the fact that this is seen as this marker of beauty, and that how the foot or the person came out on the other end really, changed, but still themselves. So you can interpret it however you want. That's the great thing about this class. Okay, so now our next one starts here where it says front cover. This was one that was done with cardstock. So if you look up here at Emma's, this one was actually done through that folding technique that I showed you all. The first little folding one where you use a like a rectangular piece of paper and you fold it and you cut it in one spot. This one here was created with cardstock or like bristleboard paper, and she stitched the edge of it to hold the pieces together. So this story, again, a lot of these stories are open to interpretation. I think she took it from like a Disney movie, and I cannot remember which Disney movie. But as we look at it, we can see the cover, which is introducing the characters, right? Because in this case, the shapes are our characters. So she's introducing the characters with some kind of fun designs. And then when we open it up to page 1, we're introduced to the main character through color. So this is a good example of 5% color, right? Everything else is in grayscale, and we're using color to enter the work, which we would be using like right through visual hierarchy. It's our first indicator of what to look at. And it helps you to establish your main character, because most stories will have a main character. And we can see that there is the main characters in the circle form, and the rest of the characters are also in circle form. So we know they're characters too. So that kind of helps us establish the difference between the environment of the characters and the characters themselves. So that's a good strategy that you can use. And then we see, so in this page 1, we can see that the character is sort of amongst the other characters. It's about the same size. They're all kind of like molded together in this sort of like blob. But then we see in the second page that the character starts to kind of become a leader, right? And we can see that the other characters are kind of following it, and they have shifted their form. And also we're noticing a size change. So the main character is getting larger. So we can see that they're building as a character. And then we will zoom over to the page number 3, and we can see that that character has become even bigger. The characters around it have become even more manipulated, and they're starting to form and change. They're bringing up, the characters are starting to develop this texture on them. So something is affecting them. And we could think about, okay, what's affecting them? Maybe it's everything that's around them. See how the edge here has got very sharp lines, very geometric. And these could be seen as some sort of outside force that are going up against these characters. So we could even perceive them as sort of organizing to fight this force, right? So they're a little bit in disarray. They're kind of, fighting the force. But then when we get into page 3, they disappear. And we can see that the people, the characters, they're not people, the characters have changed. And all of a sudden, this like nice ribbon is coming through them. So something's uniting them. So perhaps they followed this main character, this blue blob, and the blue blob may have led them into this unification. But we can see that the blue blob has gone kind of behind them now, as if they're sort of unified in their own way. And then in the last frame of the story, we see that the ribbonish sort of forms have all come together to create a unified character. So again, it's open to interpretation. We see that the main character has gotten even bigger and is glowing even more. Perhaps, that is an indicator of what happened at the end of the story, that the sort of blobs that were kind of all around were unified, became their own self. And it could be a lot about finding the self, or how some other people in our lives help us to find ourselves. At least that's how I see it. But this particular student left it pretty open to interpretation, and that's totally fine. For the last one I'm going to show you today, this is kind of a sad one, so get your tissues out. This was made with stitching as well. She used cardstock paper and stitched the edge. You can see it a tiny bit there on the left-hand side over here. And this is a story of how this particular student grew up and struggled through childhood. Okay, so I'm going to take you through the story. And I like to show this one after the last one because this is much more straightforward. So the last one I showed you was open to interpretation. Well, this one I think tells you more specifically what the story is and does a really good job telling the story. Okay, so we have a family of 5 here. Okay, we have 5 characters. And the main character, again, is standing out with that 5% of color, like we talked about before, and is obviously standing out. Not only, we can tell that that character is part of the rest of the family because it's in a cube, right? It's a brick wall, but it's colorful, so it makes it stand out, and it's got some organic curvular shapes going. So automatically we can associate meaning with shapes here. We can see sort of the dad, the mom, the siblings. They are all very static, very geometric, kind of hard and rough around the edges, perceived as perhaps, more not as kind or welcoming, whereas the main character is curvular or organic and colorful, more inviting, and is obviously contrasting and standing out from the rest of their family. Okay, so in the second frame, we can see that the main character is holding their family on their back, and there's some outside sources that are affecting them too. So perhaps there were stressors in this person's upbringing. Maybe they struggled with being poor. Maybe they struggled with home security. Who knows? There's lots of different things and factors that could affect us growing up. But it is clear that they are taking on the burden for their family. Okay. And we can see that growing in intensity, right? So the burden is right here in these ziggy zags. So see how these ziggy zags, these are shapes, and they're telling the story. Sorry, I get excited about this stuff because I'm a dork. But they get bigger and they get more prominent. And we can see that all of a sudden, the forces have taken over and this person is melting. So they're going from being more of a block to more of a blob. And they're being torn down by these outside forces because they're carrying the burden of their family on their back. So if we hop over to page 3 and 4, we can see that there's like a journey happening now, that this main character has been completely sort of pushed down and melted by their family, and they're going through some sort of effect, right? This turning up in this next frame is sort of overtaking the person to where they are just becoming one. The family is just so dysfunctional. The person has lost their identity. They're coming sort of sucked into the trauma and the sort of intensity of the family. And we can see that then in the next frame 5 and 6, that she's just done. She's just melted and has been taken over completely. And they're shaping her back into this sort of square form, trying to get her back into their sort of toxic family. Then in 7 and 8, something changes. She remains in her sort of organic blobby form, and she starts to break through. She's breaking through sort of metaphorically the family. And then in the next page, we see her walking away. There's her shadow. There she is up here in the foreground. You can see her color there, and she is walking away. She's been influenced by her family, right? Because she still has some of that gray around her, or she has some of that gray around her now. That's sort of new. But she's breaking through, and here she is. She's breaking through. And then who's this? Who's this little blue blob? What's going on here? Uh-oh. She's met someone. And in this case, it was her husband, okay? And this sort of character, they come together, and he pulls her out of her baggage of her family. So then when we hop into page 11 and 12, her and her partner are together. It's not perfect. There's clouds here, which I think could be a little bit too objective, but that's okay. There's darkness happening, right? Something's affecting them. Things, it's life, right? But the clouds start to lighten, okay? Her burden, her sorrow start to lighten. Who's this little red blob? New character. Can you guess? It's a baby. It was her first child that she had. So this is her personal story. Uh-oh, second blob, third blob. She's had 3 children. And as we can see over and over, the clouds are clearing. They're becoming lighter, and they are unified as one sort of happily ever after family. Okay, so that's enough story time for the day. So you can see now that a general overview of our assignment. You're going to move on now to taking the quiz, and then I'm going to have some discussion boards available for some initial sketches that are going to get us started on our zines. I can't wait to see what you guys will do. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.